Welcome you, sir. The current session will be taken by the Dr. Ishwar Kumar. Dr. Ishwar Kumar is currently working as an assistant faculty at Entrepreneurship Development Institute of India, Ahmedabad. He is also involved in conducting research on entrepreneurship development trainings, cluster development activities, providing business development services, rural entrepreneurship, and institution building. He has an interdisciplinary education background with PhD in management, MA in criminology, PG diploma in human rights, proficiency certificate in new product design and development, and executive certificate program in public policy. He has received Indian Management Research Fund Award in 2010 and conference scholarship by Directorate General of Social Assistance and Solidarity, Republic of Turkey. Today, he will take the session on assessment of presentation skill using rubrics. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Iswar Kumar for the session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, ma'am, for the generous introduction. I hope I am audible.
Yes, sir, you are audible, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. For the benefit of the participants, I just wanted to add just one line to my introduction. As you heard from madam that I belong to an institution called Entrepreneurship Development Institute of India. So many of you are faculty members from different institutions, and you might be eager in promoting entrepreneurship in your respective institution. So in case there is any inclination towards uh, learning about entrepreneurship, either how to teach entrepreneurship or how to develop entrepreneurship or an ecosystem for entrepreneurship at the respective institutions that you are in, so you may contact me regarding that. So
Yes, sir,
we are an
definitely.
institution which facilitates all these things. So
Yes, sir,
we'll be
yes, sir.
happy to help you in doing that. Now,
Yes, sir.
moving on to the session, um, first of all, let me tell you that we are having a paradigm shift in the education nowadays. This paradigm shift has taken place mainly from a kind of education system where we were working on developing a peer-to-peer kind of I would say attainment. And now we have moved to a system wherein we are focusing more on the evidence or more on the outcome part of the uh, academic inputs that are being given. So this shift has taken place mainly because you will see there has been lot of focus on abductive learning. Now, what is this abductive learning? Let me ask a question to you, then you will understand what I am trying to refer to. So, uh, if I ask you to think for 1 minute and tell me 4 or 5 greatest achievement of human mankind, I'm sure when you might be thinking, you will find that whatever achievements you have thought about the human mankind, those achievements have taken place largely in the recent 100 or 200 years. Now, my question is, why is that our greatest achievements have come in the recent 100 or 200 years? So, this is a very basic question that I would like some of you to answer. Can anybody answer this question? Why our greatest achievements have come in the recent past. I mean, in the past 100, 200 years. Anybody would like to answer this? Friends, I want the session to be interactive. This will help us understand many things. If you want me to speak in, let's say, Hindi and English kind of mixed thing, even that is possible. Ma'am, do I need to speak in Hindi, English, both, or anybody from the coordinator side?
You can, sir.
Okay, so Hindi, English, both is maybe okay. So thank you for your response. So see,
Yes, sir.
we have developed in the recent past because of this abductive learning, and this abductive learning has come because of the dynamism that is present in the environment, and we have become more adaptable to those dynamic environment. And that is why we are applying an established knowledge uh, in different kinds of domain. Like we know that a lotus flower, a lotus leaf doesn't retain dirt, it dispels. And we use that kind of knowledge, the phenomena behind that thing, we are applying in the ceramic, and we might develop a product or service which can be developed. For example, a glass which can does not attract dirt, or which dispels dirt. So that is a kind of self-cleaning glass that can be developed. So what I am trying to refer is that whenever we are learning something, the outcome of that learning or the evidence of that learning has become important, and that evidence can be achieved only when we are dynamic in our process of learning. Okay, and that dynamism can come only when we hone our connecting skills. We use our senses for connecting things. And if we are able to connect things very easily, we will be able to abduct knowledge from one domain to another domain. That means we can draw established theory, established knowledge from one domain and apply it in another domain. So that kind of paradigm shift has taken place, and that is why you will see that at the international level we are talking about outcome based education, and this outcome based education has to be adopted at all levels within our system, and that is why we are undergoing this faculty development program. So that is the crux of it. Now we are adopting this outcome based education. You will see that the American Association of Colleges and Universities, they come up with a project which they named as value project. Now what is this value project? Value project meant that valid assessment of learning in undergraduate education. This was the project, and under that value project they came up with certain rubrics basically, and those were the standard rubrics that were identified within that project, which can help in assessing any kind of learning outcome. So those rubrics were related to critical thinking. Those rubrics were related to uh, creative thinking. Those rubrics were related to enhancing the level of inquiry or analysis within the students. Those rubrics were related to enhancing written or oral communication. Those rubrics were related to enhancing quantitative literacy among the students. Those rubrics were related to enhancing problem solving, integrative and applied learning. So These were the main frameworks or main kind of rubrics which were used to enhance all these kind of attributes among learning attributes among the students. Today I'm going to talk about how rubrics can be used for presentation, assessing students on their presentation skills. So let me share the slide and then I'll go ahead. Friends, can you see my slide?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so in this presentation, I am going to talk about assessment of presentation skills using rubrics. Okay, so we have been talking about rubrics. Now let us understand what rubrics is. And in this rubric expert, Hedy Goodrich Andrade, he defined rubrics as basically a scoring tool, okay, that lists certain criteria. Even if you try to understand the layman definition of rubric, you will find that it is a set of instruction. So from what is rubric? Rubric is a set of instruction. Here in the context of assessment, rubric is a scoring tool, a set of instruction which helps in assessment based on laid down criteria. So the rubric consists of set of instructions as well as criteria. And those criteria are based on what counts in that learning, or what should be the outcome of that learning, or what should be the purpose of that learning. So if we can whatever, if we are doing something, if we can understand why we are doing it or why we should not be doing it. So if you can differentiate between the right or wrong, or if you can differentiate between what is learning and what is not learning, then you will be able to define that criteria. So understanding what is right is important, or what counts is important, because that helps us in defining the criteria. And based on that criteria, a set of protocol is established, and based on that protocol, the assessment is done. Okay, so a rubric is basically a scoring tool, okay, that explicitly represents the performance expectation. Like as a teacher, we want the students to write the answers in a certain manner, or we want a certain content to be there in the answer. So this sets the expectation, and a rubric helps in decreasing the expectation perception gap, because a student is writing the answer from a different perspective, and a teacher is assessing that answer from a different perspective. So there is expectation of teacher, and there is performance by student. If we decrease the gap between this expectation and perception, okay, so things will be much better. Okay, and rubrics helps in doing that, because the teacher lays down the expectation that the teacher has from the student, and the student is able to perceive. If the student is able to perceive those expectations in the right manner, the student will try to meet that expectation. So rubrics helps in doing that. Okay, rubrics can be used as a wide array in different kinds of assignments, like if the student is writing a dissertation, or student is presenting something, or student is writing some exam, doing some project. So in any kind of assignment that is given to the student, rubrics can be used for assessment. So rubric consists of different kinds of scales, like it consists of holistic scales, it can consist of different kinds of checklists, it can consist of different kind of ratings, or it can consist of a very comprehensive analytical kind of assessment. So either it can be a holistic numerical based assessment, either it can be based on a checklist, either it can be based on the rating scale, or it can be very comprehensive analytical kind of uh, assessment. Then rubrics are used to examine how well the students have met learning outcomes. So we understand that it is not a peer kind of assessment. You are not comparing one student with the other. Rather, you are having certain expectations, certain outcomes has to be there based on that learning. And we are trying to understand that how much that outcome could be achieved based on the learning that the student has received. So it's a different kind of assessment. It's a outcome oriented kind of assessment that we are doing using rubric. Okay. Typically, it includes observable, measurable descriptors. So those rubrics are basically the descriptors or the criteria that define the expectation at each level of performance. So there can be a very excellence level, there can be average level, there can be a below average level. So different levels of performance can be decided, and at each level there can be descriptors, and based on the scoring of those descriptors, the level could be decided. Okay, so it helps in understanding how much the learning outcome of the student, or how the student how much the student has met the expectation using the rubrics. So a rubric is a scoring guide with criteria for evaluating students' work in direct relation to one or more program outcomes, rather than comparison with peers, and it is a rating scale indicating different levels of performance. Why we use rubrics? So Andrade has mentioned that rubric helps students and teachers define quality. Why we are focusing so much on these outcomes or quality? I'll tell you my personal observation. Like when I was in school and college, I always felt that do I have the right kind of ability to fetch a job? So when that confidence level is shaky, it means that the learning outcome or the perception of that learning outcome is not there. So this quality or this outcome oriented assessment basically helps in developing that confidence in the student, whether through this learning I can achieve a certain outcome or not. And that is why we are focusing more on the outcome based assessment, so that the student get that confidence of achieving something, because the student will feel that yes, I can do this, that's why I'll be able to achieve this. Okay, if the student knows how, for example, I am taking the case of entrepreneurship. If a student knows that what kind of competency is required to be an entrepreneur, whether I have to take calculated risks, whether I should have innovative and creative mindset, whether I should be able to develop a good kind of network. So if the student is assessed, or the competency of the student is assessed based on these kind of criteria, the student will somewhere be able to understand himself or herself and will be able to understand or get that confidence that yes, I can do this. I can develop a network, I can take calculated risk, I can identify business opportunities and things like that, which are uh, mandatory things in developing an enterprise. Okay. So similarly, if the student is writing an essay or presenting something, if the student understands that if I can create that content, if I can organize that content, definitely that confidence will help in reproducing. Okay. So by using rubrics or by using an outcome based assessment, we are trying to elevate the level, or we are trying to move from the equity to excellence level of learning outcome. Okay. When students use rubrics regularly to judge their own work, they begin to accept more responsibility for the end product, and they understand whether they have that ability to create or not in reality. So they know their level, they understand their strength as well as weakness, and this is the beauty of this outcome based assessment. Okay. Rubrics reduce the time teachers spend grading students work, because the student is able to understand the weakness and strength, as well as at the same time, if the criteria are laid, the teachers are easily able to tell the student why they have been graded in such a way, what are the strengths of the student, what are the weaknesses of the students, and this feedback mechanism helps the student a lot.
Hello, sir.
Hello.
Sorry to interrupt you, sir. Slides are not changing, sir.
I haven't changed it. Why you use rubric? This slide is
Yeah, someone has written in chat, sir. Someone has written in chat.
so. Just check whether it is changing. I have tried to change it. Sir, is it changing?
Mhm. No, sir, it's not changing.
Okay, I'll stop sharing and I'll share it again, sir. Okay.
Okay, sir.
I have stopped sharing, but I think it's stuck, sir. Although I stopped sharing, but now is it changing, sir?
It's not. It's not visible, sir.
Okay, it's not visible. Okay.
Share it again, sir.
Okay. I'll share it again, sir.
Okay.
Now is it visible, sir?
Yeah, visible, sir. Visible, sir.
Okay. So I was on this slide and I was discussing that why we use rubrics. Okay, and I had talked about that since we want the student to get confidence from the learning that we are trying to impart to the students. Okay, and the student will feel confident only when the student will be able to apply that knowledge in real life. Okay, and that uh, confidence will come only when the student understands that some outcome has to be achieved and what are the criteria on which that outcome can be of high quality. So using rubrics, we try to impart a sense of quality within the student. Okay, so that is why we use rubrics in our assessment mechanism. Second thing, that the rubrics helps the student in assessing himself or herself. The rubric helps in benchmarking, And because of benchmarking, the student is able to understand their strength as well as their weakness. And this understanding of their strength and weakness helps them in improvising. So the student understands whether they have yet to improve or they have been able to achieve that benchmark. Okay. So this is the importance of rubrics. Then rubrics reduce the teacher's time and that is spent on grading, because students are not confused. Let's say if we give some marks out of 100 or something to the student does not exactly know in each of the subject that, let's say in a subject like history or some other kind of subjects, generally from the social sciences, if we take, and if we grade the student, give them a certain mark, the student does not know, only perceives that okay, this must be the average marks or this must be something. But rather than understanding who has got highest and who has got lowest, and in comparison to highest and lowest, the student is able to benchmark himself using that to uh, coordinates, I would say, but not able to understand that where is his or her weakness and which aspect of the assignment has to be improved. When we lay down the criteria, let's say if the student is writing an essay, and if we lay down the criteria on which the essay will be assessed, so the student will be able to understand on what criteria, what kind of score the student has got. So even the aggregate score will be able to reflect a lot of things to the students. So this decreases the time of the teachers, basically, assessment time of the teachers. Okay, because of this feedback mechanism, it helps. Parents usually like the rubric concept once they understand it, because rubrics helps them also in improvising the grades of the children. So they are able to counsel their children, they are able to help their children. Okay. So rubrics is a win-win kind of situation if we are focusing on learning based outcomes. Now, what do rubrics consist of? So, as we said, that rubric consists of different kinds of guidelines which uses criteria for assessing the learning outcome. So, those learning outcomes could be assessed using different kinds of scales, because scales helps us quantify or make it more objective, okay, make it more reliable. So because of the reliability, replicability, because of the consistency in the result, we use different kinds of scales. So those scales can be holistic kinds of scale which allow the rater to assign a single score, because it is a holistic, so it gives a overall score based on the judgment of the work. But there are different, although it's a lesser time consuming exercise, but this does not allow for the feedback to be given. Okay, so generally in rubrics the holistic kinds of scales are used, but not in every cases. Okay, so depending on the kind of exercise or the kind of feedback that needs to be given to the student, the scale selection has to be done. Like there are certain scales which are dichotomous scale, which are like uh, a checklist which can be answered in yes or no. Let's say whether the student has performed this or not, yes or no, kind of thing. So this kind of checklist is easy to use. However, again, this might not provide substantive level of information related to the performance level of the students. So checklist has its own limitation as a scale. Then rating scales are there, which identify a range of performance without specific descriptors. That means without having a performance level. They rate the outcome based on criteria, but does not have the level of that criteria. Okay, so it has got its own limitation. Okay, mainly in terms of providing feedback to the how they have excelled or whether they have met the criteria. This we are able to tell in the rating scale, but we are not able to decide on the level of the performance of them. In the analytical scale, we are able to articulate more on the performance level of them. So there is criteria as well as there are levels of that criteria that is mentioned there. So on the y-axis, we can have criteria, and in the x-axis, we can have levels of those criteria. So this can give a very holistic kind of picture about the learning outcome or the grades or scores that are given based on those analytical parameters. Now, what are the benefits of using rubrics? So rubrics establishes, like I said, that it helps in decreasing the gap between the teacher's expectation and student's perception. Student perceives I have done well, whereas the teacher expects a certain answer and the teacher's expectations have not been met. So there will be a gap. So using rubrics, we decrease that gap. Okay. Then it can help in evaluating students' work very consistently because there are criteria. So that is why based on criteria, when it is assessed, things become consistent. It makes it more easier or efficient way of assessing the student work in a multifaceted manner, or it's a multi-criteria based on framework for assessment of student performance at different levels. So because of criteria and because of the levels, rubrics is a very, I would say, very comprehensive kind of assessment that is there for the student's outcome. Now, what are the challenges of using rubrics? Generally, if we are going for analytical kind of assessment using rubrics, then it is a time-taking exercise because you will have to first decide on the criteria. As a teacher, you have to develop that criteria first. So first, you have to understand the learning outcome. Then you have to develop the criteria for assessing that learning outcome. Then you have to describe the level of that learning outcome. So lot of descriptions have to be developed. Lot of assessment criteria has to be developed. So in-depth understanding of that assignment or the learning outcome has to be there. So it's a time-taking exercise and it requires a lot of efforts to develop those rubrics because a pilot test and other things has to be. So it's more like a exploratory research kind of thing that goes into in development of rubrics. Then need to include descriptors of specific criteria. So you cannot just have a assessment criteria. Means when you are ranking or rating on that assessment criteria, if somebody is getting a high score or low score on that, so you will have to define on what basis a high score is given, on what basis low score is given. So this kind of thing has to be there. So it requires a lot of descriptors, lot of exemplars, or on which the benchmarking can be done. Okay. Then at times it may be range like from holistic to an analytical kind of scale is there. So depending on the requirement, we might need a less precise to a more precise kind of scale for assessing the performance. Now, how do we create and use a rubric? I'll stop here for a moment and ask if there is any question from the participant side. I think there is no question from the participant side, so I'll move ahead. So I was talking about that how do we create a rubric and how do we use a rubric in any kind of assessment. So uh, first thing is that in the process of creating rubrics, we have to first understand or review the student level learning outcome. So in whatever we are teaching, the first thing is understanding what kind of learning outcome could be there based on the theoretical input or based on the assignment that is given, based on the field which will be done by the student. So based on the experiment which will be done by the student. So ultimately, what kind of learning the student will attain. So that must be understood. Then we have to break that student work in different kinds based on the learning outcomes that could be there. So uh, that fragmentation of the activity or the procedure has to be done based on the learning. And then the criteria has to be established that this part will be, let's say if you are writing an essay, so or we understand that essay has got different kinds of sections in it. It has got certain kind of introduction, it has got certain kind of conclusion, it has got certain kind of body. There has to be a different certain kind of language that has to be there. There has to be grammatical aspects into it. Then overall presentation could be there. So it is being assessed based on the structure, based on the language, based on the grammar, based on the overall intent of the writer. So several things are being assessed. So those, based on that, every criteria is established. And then based on the criteria, the scale is identified in order to ascertain that how we can call something as excellent, how we call something as good, how we can call something as average, how we can call something as poor. So that scale has to be required in order to determine. When we determine that range of that scale, and we basically take the scale in order to quantify, make it more objective. And you will see another thing that the scales, the length of that scale will definitely matter in the assessment process. So as a evaluator, we have to understand the length of the scale. If we can differentiate more on those criteria, or if the student is able to differentiate more on the criteria, then a longer scale can be possible. But if the student or the assessor is not able to differentiate between the criteria, uh, it is better to have a checklist kind of scale or a longer, shorter length scale could be there. So that's why we see that we have a holistic scale which is very small, which is a single number scale. We have the checklist which is a dichotomous scale. Then we have a rating scale which is much more precise. And then we have the analytical scale which is a very comprehensive kind of scale. So this determination of range and target of these scales basically the preciseness of the scale what we are talking about. This will depend on the level of the student as well as the level of the assessor. If both can differentiate at a larger level, then a longer length scale or more comprehensive scale can be used. If they are not in a position to assess it at that minutest level, then or this assignment might not require that kind of minute assessment, then a shorter length scale or a scale which is more holistic could be used. Once the scale has been decided, the pilot has to be done. So a sample of students can be taken up, they can be given assignment, and they can be assessed, feedbacks can be taken from them, and based on that sampling kind of assessment, aggregate scores can be found out, and then it can be seen whether that kind of scale is reflecting the real learning outcomes among the students or not. So whether the evaluator is satisfied with that kind of scoring mechanism, or the student is satisfied, or the SSC is satisfied with that scoring mechanism or not. So feedbacks have to be taken on. So if we find that the criteria that has been laid down, the performance levels that have been laid down, the uh, range of the scale that is taken, it all meets the requirement of assessment, which is a reliable kind of assessment as per the student as well as the teacher, then we can use that scale or we can use that rubric in the assessment, performance assessment of student in any kind of academic activity. So what we do, we basically have already told all these things. So what we are doing, we are trying to understand the student level outcomes. So there could be questions like, where in the program do students have opportunity to demonstrate that they have achieved in each of the outcomes. So if the student has been given an assignment, so how the student can reflect that learning outcome. So what kind of opportunities will they get an opportunity to present at the end of the assignment, or will they be able to demonstrate some outcome? So what exactly is the opportunity for the student to demonstrate what they have learned? So we have to identify those opportunity. Okay, then there could be like examination, there could be dissertation defenses, there could be internship experience or internship report, there could be research paper. So there could be some course outcomes that could be there. So depending on the opportunity, this kind of assessment mechanism could be identified. Now, after identifying the student work, once we have mapped the outcomes and what would be the source of exhibiting those outcomes, we are able to identify, correlate it with the learning outcome. Then, based on the correlation of the learning outcome, as I told, that we are able to identify the critical components and we establish criteria to assess that critical outcome. Then I have already told about the scales. Okay, so we have extensively discussed on these scales, and as I was telling that in terms of preciseness, these scales vary. So there is a continuum based on of scales based on the preciseness. So some scales are very precise and some are very holistic. And from holistic to very comprehensive or very precise scale, the range varies. And each of these scales have their merit and demerit. Then, in terms of determination of range and target, so we generally identify the level of the performance, and that may be meeting expectation or above expectation or below expectation. So any kind of performance level could be created, and it may be 3 point, 4 point, 5 point. As I said, if the more you can differentiate, the more the longer could be the level of performance level that could be decided. And for each performance level, you can have a scoring mechanism. Piloting the rubric is already told. Then developing a sample plan and aggregate score. Now, let me define that if you are developing a rubric, then how should we understand that we have developed a good rubric? So for this, this slide is there. Okay. So if you are developing rubric, how would you understand that you have developed a good rubric? So for that, what could be the criteria for assessing whether we have created the right kind of rubric or not? So when we are developing any kind of rubric, it, the selection and clarity of criteria has to be there. So this is whether the criteria is clear or not is a rubric in the process of rubric development. And we see it has been assessed at 3 levels. One is unacceptable, another is delivering, and another is acceptable. So 3 criteria has been decided. And in terms of clarity of and selection of criteria, we see it would be unacceptable when the criteria being assessed are unclear, have significant overlap between one criteria as well as the another criteria. So when you are not able to clearly distinguish between one and the other criteria, then it is not a good rubric. It is unacceptable. Okay. So the criteria must be mutually exclusive in nature. Okay. There shouldn't be any overlapping or there shouldn't be any conflict in the criteria that we have created. So what is an acceptable kind of criteria? All criteria are clear, distinct, and derived from appropriate standards for task and subject area. So whenever we are creating any kind of criteria, we have to ensure that those criteria are mutually exclusive from each other. They are very clear, very distinct, and they are each of these criteria are measuring a different kind of outcome. Then distinct between levels. Now the levels like unacceptable, developing, and acceptable, or unacceptable kind of or exceeding acceptable, below standard, average, or above standard. So whatever we are levels we are keeping, those levels should also be very distinct. Like if it is unacceptable, you can see that little or no distinction can be made between the level of achievement. At the same time, it is acceptable when each level is distinct and progresses in a clear and logical order. So whatever criteria we keep, whatever level we keep, those should be highly clear and distinct. Then quality of writing. What does this mean? Writing is not understandable to all. So whatever we are trying to communicate, or the way we are trying to describe a criteria or a level, that description or that quality of writing should be very clear. That should be good. That should be communicable. So it is very, very important whenever we are writing the description of any criteria or any level, that should be clearly communicated. Writing an understandable to all users of rubric, including students, has clear specific language that helps raters reliable agree on score. So the score reliability will come when it has got that face validity. What is face validity? Face validity is the way I'm writing, whether the person who is receiving at the other end is accepting, is able to perceive in the same way or not. If I am writing from a different perception and somebody is reading it from a different perception, then mismatch of perception will take place. So quality of writing basically means matching the perception. Whatever we are writing, we are trying to match the perception. So the whatever we are trying to communicate to the let's say SSC, the SSC must read and understand in the same spirit, same manner. Then reliability of scoring. So cross scoring among faculty or student often result in significant differences. Now this talks about the reliability. So there should be reliability of scoring, and if the descriptors are very communicable and if the levels are understandable, that means if the people who are assessing or those who are being assessed are able to differentiate, the score will be reliable. So this is very, very important. Okay, because until and unless the SSC or the assessor is not able to differentiate between the scoring, it won't be reliable, and there will be problems. Like if I assess, I'll be assessing and giving a different score, and if somebody else will assess, will be giving a different score, because there is my understanding about the score is different than other person's understanding, and it is simply happening because the descriptors are not very clear. So this kind of problems do occur in the rubric based assessment. Then use of rubric to communicate expectations and guide students has to be there. That means that guidance or protocol for using the rubric has to be there. So far we were telling about creating that rubric. Now the way of using that rubric is also important. So rubric serves as a primary reference point as a student begins their work for discussion and guidance, as well as for evaluation of student work. So rubric must be having certain set of guidelines for understanding the criteria. Then there should be description of that criteria, so that, and then based on that criteria, how the students work can be evaluated, so that when the students are communicated about the different rubrics, they are able to understand it, they understand how they have to meet or excel on those rubrics, so that whenever the assessment comes based on that rubric, they are able to understand where they lag behind in the performance. Then engagement of student in using rubrics. So acceptable kind of rubrics engages the student, because rather I would suggest that students themselves should be engaged in the development of that rubric, because it is the student who is basically fulfilling that assignment. Student understands the pain point of it. So if the rubrics are developed with the help of the SSC, it will be more reliable, and they will be able to internalize it much more than if the rubric is developed and designed by the assessor. So SSC oriented or SSC centric rubric should be designed, because that will be more engaging and more acceptable. Any questions so far? Do we have any question from the faculty members, participants? Okay, all right. Now, let me move to the core of this session, which is about creating rubrics or using rubrics for assessing the presentation skills of the students. Now, before moving on to the creation of rubrics for assessing the presentation skill and all, so far what we have talked about, that why rubrics is important, how rubrics helps in assessment, and how it helps in creating the criteria, creating the level, what we can consider as a good rubric, how we can design a good rubric, who should be involved in the creation of the rubric, and things like that. I have also discussed about why we are focusing more on rubric-based assessment rather than the kind of assessment that is a traditional one, which in which the students are scored on a benchmark of, let's say, 100 marks or so, and they are given certain marks out of that maximum marks, and a peer level comparison can be done based on those marks. However, those marks are not able to represent the real weakness or strength of the student. The student is not able to understand where they have lagged behind or where they need to improve. So a feedback mechanism is absent in the traditional form of assessment. And if the teacher is assessing, let's say, 100 or 200 students in one go, the teacher will not able to uh, keep into mind everything related to each and every student. So a rubric based assessment helps in examining each and every aspect of the course, whether it is a practical examination, whether it is a presentation which the student is giving, whether it is a written examination that the student is giving, whether it is any kind of demonstration that they are making. So each of the component or each of the opportunity that is given to the student to exhibit their learning outcome could be assessed using the rubrics, which is simply a guideline based on certain criteria for assessing the performance level of the student based on the one or more learning outcomes. Okay, so this is what we have done so far. Now, moving on to the design of rubrics for assessing presentation skill. So I have mentioned certain rubrics, and for example, and we can also have level. For example, here we have three levels, like if we are assessing the presentation skill of students, the student can be either below expectation of the teacher, or simply met expectation or average, or somebody who has excelled that expectation. So beyond average expectation is there. And if we are assessing the presentation skill of the student, we might have criteria like how the presentation has been organized. What is the sequence of that presentation? Okay, so a below expectation kind of presentation will not have a logical sequence of it. They might abruptly jump to different kind, like they have introduced or talked about the introduction part of it, or why it has to be done, and suddenly they move into some other section which is not in the logical flow. So one is not able to understand what the presenter is trying to communicate. So such kind of presentation skill will be considered as below expectation. So what has to be called as below expectation, or what has to be called as average, what has to be called as good, what has to be called as above expectation or exemplary, so we can decide on the level based on the kind of description we attach to it. Okay, and similarly, if we are assessing the presentation skill of the students, we can have n number of criteria. These are just general criteria that I am going to talk about, but we may have several specific criteria based on that. So organization of the presentation is one such criteria. Then what content is being presented in each of those sections, like what kind of content is being presented in the introduction of it, whether introduction must talk about the overall thing, or whether introduction must talk about the importance of that presentation, or whether the introduction must talk about let's say the method part also. So it can be anything. What content has to be there in each section is very, very important. So that must be decided by the SSC or by the presenter. So such criteria has to be. So generally we see that in terms of content, the content must be thorough. It must have facts and figures into it. It must have corroborative evidences, so that the content becomes much more reliable. Then in terms presentation skill can be assessed in terms of subject knowledge. So whether the student is able to demonstrate that subject knowledge or not through the presentation. Similarly, we can take up criteria like ability to answer question. So if some presentation is being done by student, there might be questions from the audience side. So whether the student is able to logically satisfy the uh, questions related to that presentation to the audience or not. So that is another criteria on which the student can be assessed. Then quality of slide preparation, whether that it is a readable slide, whether that professionalism is exhibited through the slide or not, whether it is imaginative or whether it has been taken from somewhere, whether the uh, resolution and other things are of high quality or not. So in terms of visibility, in terms of professionalism, in terms of color and other design, in terms of what has been communicated, the way things have been imagined. Like some people mention just few words, some people mention the entire line, some people mention entire paragraph. So why it has been prepared in such a way? So we have to, some people try to present it in a very graphical kind of or pictorial kind of thing. So whether that level of communication that has come through that slide is there or not. So how easier it is for the audience to understand it, it is basically the quality of slide. Then voice quality and pace of speaking, like the throw of the voice should be very calm. It shouldn't be very haphazard kind of thing. The speaker should not speak very quickly. So all these kind of things does matter in the presentation skill. So above expectation kind of presentation would be considered where the delivery is excellent. It is conversational. the voice is modulated well. The it projects enthusiasm in the speaker. There is interest and confidence in the speaker. So all these things are the basic attributes of a exemplary presenter. Similarly, we see that when we are assessing the presentation, there are several other things that does matter. So first was what is being presented, so content of it, how it has been organized and other things. Then the way it is being presented becomes important, and there were criteria uh, on which we were trying to understand that how it has been presented. Now, third set of criteria can be based on the body language, like the mannerism. So, you in mannerism you see uses of body language effectively. So, how the body language is being used to communicate to the audience or maintain the audience interest. So, that matters. Then, eye contact is another thing that matters. Although you will see that in the online environment things are quite different, but in a physical presentation the eye contact does matter, because in the entire conviction takes place through this eye contact. So slides are used effortlessly to enhance speech, but speech could be effectively delivered without them. So, perfect eye contact is very, very important in order to convince the audience. Then, next comes the attire. So, there is a Shakespeare's line which says, uh, which in which Shakespeare has says that apparel maketh a man. That means it says that it is apparel which makes a man. Now, uh, Shakespeare has used this line because uh, we, we we generally use the word जो दिखता है वो बिकता है वाला. In the same context and in the same parlance Shakespeare had used. So the attire of the presentation basically is linked to the professionalism, linked to the body language, or linked to the overall presentation of it. So attire becomes a very, very important, because if the person is not dressed as per the occasion, then it doesn't look nice, because we have an expectation about the presenter. And if the presenter doesn't, or the attire of the presenter does not meet that occasion or does not meet that expectation, then there is some where gap in the entire presentation. So this has to be taken into consideration. That is all regarding the presentation skill. Now this presentation skill can be further divided in terms of different kinds of presentation. Like we may have presentation while we are exhibiting our assignment. We might have presentation where we are presenting some kind of poster. We might have presentation when we are presenting our dissertation, research paper presentation. So presentations can be done at different point in time, and depending on the kind of content that we are going to present, and depending on the kind of occasion in which we are presenting that content, these rubrics might differ. Like if we are presenting let's say a PhD thesis, then the rubrics might be different. If we are presenting a research paper, then the rubrics might be different. Okay, so let's say if we are presenting a PhD thesis, for example, so you will see that Presentation has got three aspects: what you are presenting, how you are presenting, and then the support mechanism. That means how you are dressed, what is your eye contact, and all those kind of things. So there are three aspects of this presentation skill that we are talking about, and we can develop rubrics based on these three aspects. So when we are developing the rubrics for, let's say, presentation of a PhD thesis, so what is the content of the thesis? So generally, when we are presenting a PhD thesis, we talk about the topic, problem statement, we talk about the methodology, we uh, talk about the data collection, we talk about data analysis, we talk about conclusion, we talk about implications of the study, we talk about limitations of the study, we talk about uh, future research suggestions. So those are basically the content of it. So the SSC must decide what are the key things that the presenter must include in the presentation. Then comes that what should be the sequence of it. When should the limitations of the study come? When should the conclusion of the study come? When should the uh, implications come? Whether the implication is theoretical implication, whether the implications are practical implications, when should the methodology we talked about, when should the literature review talked about. So there are different sections, different aspects of that PhD thesis, and there must be a logical sequence of it while presenting. Then we must talk about how clearly each of these have been communicated. Okay. What kind of language has been used, what kind of presentation skill has been used, what kind of slides have been, whether things have been presented in 100 or 200 slide, or is it presented in 30-40 slide. So whether the size of the presentation is appropriate or not, even that is a point of assessment. Then what is the content within a slide, whether it is too wordy or whether it is appropriately worded so that it is visible and clearly communicated to the audience. So these things will matter. Similarly, if it is a assignment presentation by a student, so there the procedure of that assignment becomes important, the learning of the student becomes important, how the student will apply the outcomes of that learning. So implications part of that is very, very important. So depending on the kind of presentation, we have to develop the rubric. And like I presented, that rubric of a rubric, that means how we should create a rubric, and in that we have seen here that the selection criteria has to be very clear. Each and every opportunity of exhibiting the outcome, knowledge outcome of the student must be captured through the rubric. Then whatever levels we are keeping in that rubric assessment, so whatever criteria and whatever the performance levels that we are keeping, each must be defined and described very clearly, so that it is clearly communicable that each of these criteria and levels are mutually exclusive in nature. Then the way we are writing those descriptors must be very distinct and clear, so that the way you are trying, whatever you are trying to communicate to the user, they are able to understand it in the same way. So face validity of the content or rubric is very, very important. You cannot name the rubric in any way. It has to be named in such a way that whatever you are trying to communicate to them, they are able to understand it that way. Then there should be inter-rater or inter-assessor differences in the rating of the rubric. Otherwise, that means there is issue with the reliability of that rubric. So this has to be assessed at the first instance. Like face validity of the rubric is very important. Similarly, the scoring mechanism of the rubric also must be tested in a small focused group kind of thing. Then it has to be tested at the pilot level so that it is reliable in nature. And then another suggestion could be that rubrics must be created with the involvement of the SSC or the student so that it is SSC centric or student centric rather than a very exclusive kind of thing which is created by the assessor rather than SSC. So engagement of the SSC is equally important in development of rubrics. So that is all from my side. If we have questions from the participants, I would love to take it. Is there any question from the participant side?
Is there any questions? Questions?
Ma'am, I think there is no question from
Yes, sir.
any of the participants.
Yes, sir.
So,
Yes, sir.
I have
Now,
finished my
yes, sir.
part.
Yes,
So should we wind it up?
yes, sir.
Okay, okay, okay. Thank you.
Sir,
Yes, yes.
thank you, sir, for the session. Your session will surely help our participant to understand the concept of the rubrics. On behalf of AICT, CSV2, and Government Polytechnic Jaspur, I express a sincere thanks to you, sir. Also, thank you for giving your precious time. Thank you so much, sir.
Uh, Thank you from my side for giving me this opportunity. I
Yes,
sincerely thank the uh, dignitaries at the Government Polytechnic Jaspur for involving me in this session, as as well as I would thank the participants for very patient listening. But I was expecting some communication from both sides so
yes,
that it would have been more interactive and the learning outcomes could have been much better. Even for me, it would have been some kind of learning. Otherwise, it was a one-way delivery rather. So
yes.
anyhow, I thank all the participants for being with me and patiently listening to my session. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you
so much.
all.
Dear
Ma'am,
participant,
should I leave?
yes, sir, yes, sir.
Oh,
Dear participant, thank you for your kind attention. There is a break of 1 hour. Feedback form is shared in chat box. Submit it positively. Professor Amit Kumar Saxena will take the next session. We will start our next session at 2:30. Thank you for your cooperation.